Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Darryl Jones. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I have a few duties to discharge before I start. First of all, can I draw your attention to the exits? There are two at the front, there are some in the middle, and there are some at the back. Bear in mind that the exits may be behind you. Can I also ask you to make sure that your mobile phones are switched off? This evening is exactly the kind of thing that a university should do. Universities are a public good. We perform a public service. Universities may be funded increasingly precariously by the state, but we are not institutions of the states. Academics are not civil servants, not bound by codes of impartiality and collective responsibility in the same way. This is an important point to make, and one which is often misunderstood. What we as universities have to offer society is our independence of mind and spirit, our critical and creative powers. If we want our students to be intellectual citizens, then we need to demonstrate that intellectual citizenship ourselves. I don't often find myself quoting from the college strategic plan. But on this occasion, I'm pleased to do so. Trinity, it tells us, has a mission, and I quote, "We provide a liberal environment where independence of thought is highly valued and where all are encouraged to achieve their full potential. We will fearlessly engage in actions that advance the cause of a pluralistic, just, and sustainable society." By hosting this evening, Trinity is acting in keeping with its vision of itself. The college itself takes no formal position on marriage equality. But members of the college, its staff and its students, as intellectual citizens, certainly do. How could they do otherwise? Tonight is not a debate. The college is hosting a debate on marriage equality next week. Tonight is an event in which we discuss, explore, and celebrate the ways in which same-sex relationships have been portrayed in literary culture. In doing so, as intellectual citizens, we unapologetically assume political positions. I'm proud to be a member of Trinity College this evening. Most specifically, I'm proud to be a member of the School of English, an internationally renowned university department. This is what we do, ladies and gentlemen. And now I'll hand you over to my friend and colleague, the head of the School of English, Professor Nicholas Green.
Thanks, Darryl. You've said it all. I don't have anything further to say. Just this to start with. I am delighted to be here chairing this event tonight, and I'm very grateful to Brendan O'Connell and Pádraig White for having had this idea and having brought it to this magnificent climax that we're having tonight. So thank you very much indeed, Brendan and Pádraig, for inviting me to chair this evening. I'm here as the current head of School of English, but I'm also representing the Long Room Hub. Jürgen Barkov, the director of the Hub, was very regretful that he wasn't going to be able to be here himself, but he asked me if I would welcome you on his behalf, on behalf of the Hub, which is the co-sponsor of tonight's event. Just to say a little bit about what the Long Room Hub does, it's our, as it says here, Arts and Humanities Research Institute, and the object of the Hub is to bring together scholars of different disciplines in the arts and humanities and social sciences to make possible an intellectual conversation between those different disciplines, out of which new research may emerge. But we have another function also. The Hub also has another function, which is to try to bring to a wider public a sense of the value and meaning of the disciplines in this area of arts and humanities. And that's the principle behind this series of events, of which tonight is one, called Behind the Headlines. These are our events that relate to something which is currently in a matter of public debate. For example, earlier this year, in the wake of the terrible tragedy in Paris of Charlie Hebdo, we had an event where we had a member of the School of History whose special subject was Islam. We had someone from the School of Law who dealt particularly with blasphemy laws. And this was very, very well attended, as you can imagine, and was an opportunity to show to a wider public the ways in which the various disciplines, academic disciplines, do relate to what goes on in a wider public sphere. So that is part of our thinking in tonight's event. As Darrell has made clear, this is not a debate on the subject of marriage equality. We can all have our views on that. There will be an opportunity for you to come along to a debate next week here in the college, if you so wish. This is specifically about the way in which same-sex relationships have been represented in literature. That's something that's of great interest, clearly, because of what's going on in politics at the moment, but it's not the reason for, or the purpose of this debate, of this event, to debate that question. And we think of this as an example of the way in which our discipline, the discipline of English, allows us to explore some of the issues that many of you will be thinking about because of the marriage equality referendum. Anyway, that's enough of general preamble. I now have the great pleasure of introducing our principal speaker tonight. It's really unfair that one writer should be so prodigiously gifted, so productive, and so successful in so many different forms of writing as the man I'm about to introduce. He came to prominence as a very talented journalist in the 1980s, working for Sunday Tribune in Dublin, McGill. And two of the books from that early period are In Bad Blood, Walking the Irish Border, and Homage to Barcelona, where, of course, he spent quite a lot of time in the 1970s. But then in the 1990s, a quite new Colm Tóibín, the novelist, emerged with The South, The Heather Blazing, The Story of the Night, and the Booker Prize nominated The Blackwater Lightship. That's just the last century. Since then, in the new millennium, there have been more novels. Brooklyn, about to be a major motion picture later this year, best-selling novel, followed up last year by Nora Webster. And there are two books of short stories, Mothers and Sons, and The Empty Family. But he's not content with that. He also has moved into theatre, Beauty in a Broken Place, and Testament. I can remember when I was told, a friend of Colm Tóibín said to me, you know what he's working on at the moment? I said, no. He said, The Virgin Mary. I'm sorry, come again? He's doing a monologue for the Virgin Mary. Yeah? Testament, which was produced by Druid Theatre here, with Marie Mullen in the part, and then in New York with Fiona Shaw, and I gather is currently being done in Spanish, where better. The book of his, I suppose, that is most relevant to our talk tonight is Love in a Dark Time, which is a collection of essays, I think originally written for the London Review of Books, in which he explores the ways in which gay writers, public personalities, filmmakers, poets have represented or not represented their own sexuality. And over the last week, I have been giving myself the treat of rereading his very great novel, The Master, about Henry James, and realizing again that this is, among many other things, an extraordinarily subtle and compelling study in the repression of same-sex desire. I realize now, Colm Tóibín speak first extraordinary plenary lecture at a conference, an Irish literature conference in Barcelona, I suppose just about 20 years ago. I've had the great pleasure of hearing him several times since, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing him tonight speak on the subject of the embrace of love, being gay in Ireland now. Colm Tóibín.
Thank you very much. When I came to Dublin first in 1972, if someone had told me that I was going to be an aspect of Trinity College's strategic plan, I would have had something to say about that. My own strategies would not have, I think, would have not coincided at the time, I think, with Trinity College's strategic plan. In 1996, when I had published my novel, The Story of the Night, which was in part an account of the love between two men, I received a private letter from one of the most powerful men in Ireland, someone who had served in government and was then and later a figure of immense influence in our public life. I'd never met this man, and I was surprised by the tone of the letter, that it was sort of personal, but also engaged, almost urgent. He said that it had never occurred to him until he read the book that two men could fall in love in the way straight people do, that they could wait for phone calls and messages from each other, and they could begin to long for and enjoy the loved one's company, and thus become happy in the warm glow of love. He had thought being gay was merely about sex, that it was a sexual orientation, that its embrace did not include what Kate O'Brien called in her novel The Land of Spices, the embrace of love. A few weeks later, I met a prominent Irish feminist, someone who had been at the forefront of the women's movement here, and she too expressed surprise at the intensity of the relationship between the two men in the book. "They sound like straight people," she said. I told her that was because they were like straight people, that they too wanted intimacy and love. They wanted each other, they wanted ease in their domestic and family lives. They also wanted their relationship to be publicly recognized. They wanted to move out of the shadows and into the light. I was concerned at the idea that these two educated, decent and liberal people could know so little about homosexuality. What I viewed as normal, they viewed as strange. What I viewed as an essential part of my life, they viewed as something they knew nothing about. It struck me that they must, along the way, have worked with gay people. They probably had neighbours who were gay. They may even had a family member who was gay. But in Ireland, until recently, gay people had a way of living in the shadows, not declaring ourselves. We had a sort of secret city, bars and discos, bathhouses, websites, places of assignation. And some of us had become skilled at moving between these places as though we were invisible. Invisibility became part of a survival mechanism. Its downside was that people simply did not know about us, and more importantly, did not know that our way of loving has the same contours and textures as anyone else's, the same fears and intensities, the same needs and comforts. And one of these needs includes the need for the same rituals and the same constitutional protection as other people. As gay people became, over the years, more visible and confident, and gay politics more settled and serious, then the history of what happened to us in the past became a vital element in the creation of gay identity, just as Irish history does in Ireland or Jewish history among Jewish people. It's not simply a question of finding obscure traces of gay presence in the past, although that as well, but it includes writers who were clearly or uneasily gay and whose homosexuality has a considerable bearing on the themes and tones in their work. Straight critics, non-gay critics, including ones who mean no harm, have tended to write about gay authors as though they were straight or as though it did not matter. The famous American critic Lionel Trilling, for example, published a book on E.M. Forster's fiction in 1943. In 1972, he wrote to Cynthia Ozack that, quote, "It wasn't until I had finished my book on Forster that I came to the explicit realization that he was homosexual. I'm not sure whether this was because of a particular obtuseness on my part or because homosexuality hadn't yet formulated itself as an issue in the culture. When the realization did come, it at first didn't seem of crucial importance, but then that view began to change." The gay past in writing is both explicit and hidden in a way that the gay present is, for the most part, only explicit. Soon, in the Western world, being gay will no longer involve difficulty and discrimination. Therefore, how we read the past and read into the past and judge the past are likely to become matters for great debate. The temptation to make anachronistic judgments and ask anachronistic questions is hard to avoid. Why didn't Thomas Mann come out? Could be one of those questions, which again requires historical imagination to answer. Why didn't E.M. Forster publish his only explicitly gay novel, Morris, in 1913 when he wrote it? Why didn't the gay critic F.O. Mathiasson include references to gay writers in his book American Renaissance? And also, why are gay lives presented as tragic in so much writing? Why can't gay writers give gay men or women happy endings, as Jane Austen gave heterosexuals? Why is gay life often presented as darkly sensational? Other communities who've been oppressed, for example, Jewish people, as I mentioned, or Catholics in Northern Ireland, have every opportunity to work out the implications of their oppression in their early lives. They hear the stories, they have the books around them. As gay people, on the other hand, we grew up alone. There is no history. There are no ballads about the wrongs of our past. The martyrs are all almost forgotten. It is as though, in Adrian Reach's phrase, when you were gay, you looked into the mirror and saw nothing. Thus, the discovery of a history and a tradition and a sense of heritage must be done almost by each individual, as though alone, as part of our road to freedom, or at least our road to knowledge. This is maybe why this same-sex marriage referendum campaign has been so liberating for gay people and our friends and families. It has allowed us to set out publicly and communally how we wish to be treated in the future. It has allowed us to have a public debate with our entire nation about our need for recognition and equality. It has allowed us to speak openly about the terms of our love. After 2015, it is unlikely that there will be many people in Ireland who will not know about us, or have a sense of how ordinary our desires are, or see how oddly conservative most of us are. As of now, we have, it seems, no wish to question marriage as an institution, or undermine the centrality of the family under the Irish Constitution. Instead, we seek to embrace marriage and strengthen the idea of the family and our involvement in it. We seek to enhance the institution of marriage. We want to make the same vows as others do for the same reasons. We want to live in the ease and protection which marriage offers. It's very easy to see how much happiness and relief this will bring to us and to our families. It is hard to see how this will adversely affect people who already enjoy the benefits of marriage, the majority of whom may be generous enough to want to allow us to share what they already have. What we want is strangely simple. We want to be included. The conflict between the desire for inclusion and the strategy of being invisible has roots in the gay past. Perhaps the two most prominent Irish homosexuals in the past were Oscar Wilde and Roger Casement. To the detriment of Casement, and perhaps Wilde too, they left more signs than most of what their desires were and how they acted on them. They also left considerable evidence of the complexity of their sexuality, how much they were able to conceal and deny, even to themselves. There are moments in the diaries of Roger Casement that bear a surreal and uncanny similarity to some letters by Oscar Wilde. In August 1876, for example, when Wilde was 22, he wrote to William Ward about their mutual friend Charles Todd. In our friend Todd's ethical barometer, it's marvelous Oscar Wilde talking about ethical barometer. In our friend Todd's ethical barometer, at what height is his moral quicksilver? Last night, I strolled into the theatre about 10 o'clock and, to my surprise, saw Todd and young Ward, the choir boy, in a private box together, Todd very much in the background. I wonder what young Ward was doing with him. Myself, I believe Todd is extremely moral and only mentally spoons the boy. But I think he is foolish to go about with one if he is bringing the boy about with him. He, Todd, looked awfully nervous and uncomfortable. In April 1903, when Roger Casement was 39, he noted in his diaries the suicide in Paris of Sir Hector MacDonald, who had been charged with homosexual activities in Ceylon. He wrote, this is Casement, "The reasons given are pitiably sad, the most distressing case, this surely of its kind, and one that may awake the national mind to saner methods of curing a terrible disease than by criminal legislation." The terrible disease was homosexuality, and it's possible that while Wilde, being 22, was not fully alert to his own homosexuality, but Casement at 39 had by then had many sexual experiences, and he recorded his experiences, sexual experiences, in the very same pages as he recorded the suicide of Hector MacDonald, and he's sort of distancing himself from the idea of homosexuality. And it's easy to see, I think, why homosexuals, in this dark time when everything was forbidden them and every rule was there to be broken, they created doubles, not only for public consumption, but oddly enough, privately within themselves. They made their own Dorian Gray, or they disguised one. They moved in solitude as well as in society, from being Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde, or the other way around. It's easy to read their doubleness as an aspect of their homosexuality, or of an aspect indeed of homosexuality itself. And their black diaries, their white diaries, Wilde's marriage, the exquisite domestic harmony which W.B. Yeats witnessed when he visited the Wildes with their children at the end of the 1880s, versus the seamy underworld where Wilde and Casement walked once night fell, or often indeed during the day. But when you watch other eminent Irish Victorians, the straight ones who had secret lives, figures such as Parnell, for example, or Lady Gregory, both of whom had clandestine love affairs, you realise that there is an odd connection between how people handled their Irishness and how they dealt with being homosexual. So it would be lovely if you could make the connection that homosexuality is merely an aspect of Irishness, or in fact the other way around, that being Irish is merely an aspect of being homosexual. But it was as though this moving from Ireland to England, the moving as Parnell and Lady Gregory did from being the owner of a large house and an Irish estate to becoming a champion of the people, involved a deep reimagining of the self, akin in some other way to a gay man posing as straight, or a man such as Casement, fully alert to his own homosexuality, pretending for a few moments in his private diaries that it is happening to somebody else. This idea of a very private and intimate doubleness, which entered the core of the spirit of certain Irish figures who had gnarled allegiances at the end of the 19th century, may help us to understand how William O'Shea, whose wife Parnell was having the affair with, might have both known and not known of his wife's adultery. And Parnell and Mrs. O'Shea might have become so skilled at pretending he didn't know, living as though he didn't know, while knowing all the time that he in fact knew. It's like going home if you're gay. She knows, but so-and-so knows, but doesn't know. I'm talking about the 1970s. This too was what Constance Wilde did about her husband's relationship with men. She thought they were a pose, while knowing too that they were not a pose. Thus Parnell's journey from London to Brighton, where Mrs. O'Shea lived, was like his journey from Ireland to England, from being a dull and hesitant speaker to becoming eloquent, a journey in which identity and knowledge and the very essence of the self could be transformed. The battle for recognition by gay people in Ireland, our search for visibility and the end of discrimination, began in earnest 35 years ago when David Norris, late of this parish, began a case in the High Court to have the Victorian laws which put Oscar Wilde behind bars and ruined his life be declared repugnant to the Irish Constitution. During the days when evidence was being heard, I went down to the forecourts 3 or 4 times. It was before serious journalism had developed in Ireland. It's almost impossible to imagine this, but the newspapers and RT took all their coverage from a single court reporter and reported merely the bare facts of the hearing. No reporter standing outside, no colour pieces, no drawings, no attempt to describe what was really happening in the court. There was no one writing about those tiny moments in the hearing which made all the difference. David Norris was, in my opinion, both the best and the worst person to bring such a case. He was best in that as a lecturer here, a person of immense independence of mind. He was in no danger of losing his job. But he was the worst also in the seems on the face of it not to have been greatly damaged by the laws in question. He'd not served a prison sentence or suffered directly at the hands of the law. So it was hard to see exactly what his problem was as he gave evidence. A courtroom with its adversarial traditions did not seem the best place to explain that being gay in a repressive society affects every moment of your life. Every time you look, think, remember, imagine. All these things are clouded by what is forbidden and secretive. In George Orwell's 1984, the most severe punishment for citizens was to forbid them the right to love. To most readers of the book, this seemed a cruelty far-fetched and almost impossible. For most gay people, it was a nightmare we inhabited while pretending, sometimes even to ourselves, that it was nothing, something that would not easily change, that it was dangerous to complain about. It was best to carry on as though it were a sweet dream, and the real issues, the more substantial ones, such as real politics or the economy, were more worthy of public discussion. The laws forbidding us to love, forbidding us to couple as others do, affected us, as they still do, in ways so deep and basic as to be obvious only to us and almost impossible to explain to a senior counsel in the High Court who's been paid to pick holes in the argument and suggest that what the witness is saying should be discounted by the learned judge. There was one really extraordinary moment in those proceedings when a priest, a sort of liberal priest who had agreed to come and give evidence in favour of Norris, and he was suggesting very subtly ways of interpreting the Bible which would not preclude a civilised country, which imply a civilised country with an ambiguously worded constitution, which implied certain fundamental rights from having laws against homosexuality declared repugnant to that constitution. It was a subtle argument. It was hard to make, and especially under cross-examination. But in one moment under fire, the priest used the word "we" when referring to homosexuals. The senior counsel, a very large man, a bully, or at least doing his job in the court in that way. I believe personally he's actually very nice. And he was a sort of that figure who's often called a well-known figure at the bar. He stopped, left absolute silence in the court, and he looked at the priest. And he said quietly, "Father, did you say we?" And a chilly wind blew through that court. And for days afterwards, that question in all its insinuation, in the ease with which it could be asked, stayed in my mind. So I was not surprised when David Norris lost his case in the High Court. He was represented by Mary Robinson, appealed to the Supreme Court, and 5 judges of that court ruled. And they gave their ruling early in 1983. David Norris lost again. The court was divided. The majority judgment, written by Chief Justice Tom O'Higgins, was not, I think anyone would have to agree, the most enlightened in the court's history, and not something I think of which the Supreme Court can ever be proud. The 5 judges who heard the case then were Higgins himself, who in 1966 had come within 10,000 votes of unseating Eamon de Valera from the presidency. They were also 2 judges who concurred with him, but without any comment: Thomas Finlay, who was president of the High Court, who later became Chief Justice, and Frank Griffin. And then the 2 judges who dissented from the majority judgment were Seamus Henchy and Neil McCarthy. In his High Court judgment, the first judgment which Norris lost, Mr. Justice McWilliams had made a remark which is at best unfortunate and perhaps really does not merit comment. He was writing about the idea that 2 women acting alone cannot commit the act of buggery. And he was wondering if this in fact meant that the law against buggery thus discriminated against men. And he wrote, he meant buggery, may be performed by either homosexual or heterosexual men with either men or women. Although it is perfectly obvious that such acts will usually be performed between homosexual males, which is probably what the legislatures had in mind, this is in the way of making it illegal, that does not constitute an invidious or arbitrary discrimination against homosexual citizens any more than the statutes making theft an offence constitute an invidious or arbitrary discrimination against congenital kleptomaniacs, supposing there were such a group of people. Sex equals theft, homosexuals equals congenital kleptomaniacs. It was hard not to know how the judge's mind works. If you were sitting in the court, as I was listening to this, it was tempting to wish to emigrate. It was just hard to know how far you would need to go to get away from this. That same Mr. Justice MacWilliam made reference to rights implied by Article 40 of the Irish Constitution, including Part 1 of the Section 3, which reads, which has been the most influential, I think, clause in the entire Constitution and the hardest one to read. It is, the state guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws to defend and vindicate the personal rights of the citizens. This sentence is clearly so open to interpretation. It means whatever the judge thinks it means. It would seem obvious to me that it would require the judge to declare the Victorian laws against homosexual acts between men unconstitutional. I mean, what greater personal right is there, after all, than the right to love? But it might not seem so to you or to a judge. Mr. Justice MacWilliams also had to look at the preamble to the Irish Constitution, which begins, "In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom all authority and to whom, as our final end, all actions both of men and states must be referred." And he referred again to the judgment of Mr. Justice Brian Walsh in the McGee case, the one about contraception, who said that rights under Article 40 are, quote, to be related to the laws of God as understood by Christians. Walsh then went on, it is reasonably clear that this is MacWilliams went on to say it is reasonably clear that current Christian morality in this country does not approve of buggery or of any sexual activity between persons of the same sex. This was the judgment that David Norris and his lawyers were appealing against. In his judgment, Chief Justice O'Higgins did not repeat the reference to kleptomania, but he had his own things to say. A right to privacy, or as has been put, a right to be let alone, can never be absolute. There are many acts done in private which the state is entitled to condemn, whether such be done by an individual on his own or with another. The law has always condemned abortion, incest, suicide attempts, suicide pacts, euthanasia, or mercy killing. So I suppose when he starts to think about two men making love, that's what comes into his mind: euthanasia, mercy killing, suicide pacts, suicide attempts, incest, abortion. I mean, it's hard to know what to say. He went on to say that homosexual conduct is, of course, morally wrong and has to be so regarded by mankind, and has been so regarded by mankind throughout the centuries. It cannot be said of it, however, as the plaintiff seeks to say, that no harm is done if it is conducted in private by consenting males. Very serious harm may in fact be involved. Such conduct, although carried out with full consent, may lead a mildly homosexually oriented person into a way of life from which he may never recover. This is the Chief Justice of Ireland. And he summarised his views, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that homosexuality has always been condemned. Exclusive homosexuality, whether the condition be congenital or acquired, can result in great distress and unhappiness for the individual and can lead to depression, despair, and suicide. I suppose it can also lead you to the George on a Saturday night, but he didn't. Mr. Justice didn't think of this. And he has a strange number 3, which will be news to all of us, I think, that the homosexually oriented can be importuned into a homosexual lifestyle which can become habitual. Well, if only, Anyway, he goes on about disease and he goes on about marriage. And he goes on about the state's duty to get involved in the moral life of its citizens. The two dissenting judgments are interesting. The first one was very trenchant. He was very trenchant, particularly Seamus Henchy, because he understood that the Chief Justice had gone outside his remit by giving opinions that had not been tested in court. In other words, the state had not presented that stuff about acquiring homosexual desires. I mean, it just hadn't done that. And for a judge to put that as a matter of fact without it being tested by the court was highly unusual and something that generally isn't done and is deeply disapproved of by, not only by Seamus Henchy, but by anyone who works in the law. So he talked about, he actually tried to understand the damage that had been done to David Norris, which wasn't, as I said, material damage. He talked about David Norris in a number of subtle and insidiously intrusive and wounding ways. He has been restricted in or thwarted from engaging in activities which heterosexuals take for granted as aspects of the necessary expression of their human personality and as ordinary incidents of their citizenship. It is not surprising that the repressive and constricting treatment suffered by the plaintiff affected his psychological health. As an involuntary, chronic, and irreversible male homosexual, again, just note the words involuntary, chronic, and irreversible male homosexual, he has been cast unwillingly into a role of furtive living, which has involved traumatic feelings of guilt, shame, ridicule, and harassment, and countless risks to his career as a university lecturer and to his social life generally. Those risks are not the normal lot of the fornicator, the adulterer, the sexually deviant married couple. These judges love these lists. Let me start again. The fornicator, the adulterer, the sexually deviant married couple, the drunkard, the habitual gambler, the practicing lesbian, and many other types of people whose propensities and behavior may be thought to be no less inimical to the upholding of individual moral conduct or to necessary of desirable standards of public order or morality, or to the needs of a healthy family life, or to social justice, or to other expressed or implied desiderata of the Constitution. And he went on then to write about David Norris's refusal to emigrate. And he then said, just in passing, I think the most stupid thing he said was, this is a quote, his subsequent public espousal of the cause of male homosexuals in this state may be thought to be tinged with a degree of that affected braggadocio which is said by some to distinguish a gay from a mere homosexual. Now, this is 1983, where a judge has announced that there's something that distinguishes a gay from a mere homosexual. Like, where did he get this? Anyway, the real fun judgment became Mr. Justice Neil McCarthy. He really enjoyed what he said. And his big speech, which really I think we should all learn off by heart because it's so complicated that you could think about it late at night and I think it would give you pleasure. This is Mr. Justice Neil McCarthy in 1983 on the subject of discrimination, of gay people being of gay men being discriminated under the law. Quote, if a man wishes to masturbate alone and in private, he may do so. Tick. If he and another male adult wish to do so in private, may they not do so? No. Each commits an offence under Section 11 of the Act of 1885. If a woman wishes to masturbate in private, she does not commit an offence. If two women wish to do so in private, neither of them commits an offence. If a man and a woman wish together to do so in private, not being married to each other, neither of them commits an offence. In such latter circumstances, the act committed by the woman upon the man may be identical with that which another man would commit upon him, save that his partner is a woman. And I think we should all have that written really up front. In my opinion, Neil McCarthy concluded, a very great burden lies upon those who would wish to question personal rights in order to justify state interference of a most grievous kind, in a claim to the right to perform sexual acts or to give expression to sexual desires or needs in private between consenting adults, male and female. And I mean, what was remarkable about the other judgments, or about moments in them, was how much the judges presumed to know about homosexuals. But then how odd and wrong what they said was. I mean, it was really hard to see what source they were using, what book they read, for example. And this has become, I mean, there's another judgment, I just need to move on, but there's another judgment by Mr. Justice Brian Walsh in the Geoffrey Dudgeon case. The Dudgeon case was marvellous because, you know, Ulster is British. Well, it was until they decided to repeal the laws against homosexuality, and they decided to leave them in Ulster, leave them in Northern Ireland, but have them for the rest of the United Kingdom. It was the campaign to organise this was called Save Ulster from Sodomy. And it was successful until Geoffrey Dudgeon got involved and went to the European Court of Human Rights. And I mean, there really is an extraordinary judgment there from Mr. Justice Brian Walsh, who, in every other way, was probably the most brilliant judge we've had in Ireland, with a brilliant legal mind, until it came to this small matter of homosexuals. And he said, he said in Europe, he's actually said this in Strasbourg, which is making a show of us there. He said a distinction must be drawn between homosexuals who are such because of some kind of innate instinct or pathological constitution judged to be incurable, or those whose tendency comes from a lack of normal sexual development or from habit, or from experience of some other similar causes whose tendency is not incurable. So far as the incurable category is concerned, the activity must be regarded as abnormalities or even as handicaps, and treated with compassion and tolerance, which is required to prevent those persons from being victimized. We have a right to feel, I think, that the 30 years since these men wrote these judgments have been years of progress in Ireland, and that such gross assertions about gay people could actually not be made now. We have a right to feel also that public opinion has changed. And we have a right to feel also that novelists have changed, that some of the more recent stories and novels about homosexuality, at least in the English language, have been more frank and fearless, and indeed more stylistically interesting than the work done in a previous time. The content, the idea of writing about gay characters, about whether you should make them sad or happy, became an important issue, I think, in the 20th century at various times. That the literature that gay men produced in the 1970s, for example, Gregory Wood writes about this in his History of Gay Literature, they often gave gay readers role models for use in the pursuit of the kinds of happiness that post-liberation gay life was meant to consist of. But the French philosopher Michel Foucault argued that images of homosexual happiness actually operated as serious transgression, that homosexuals had a duty to be sad, and that writers had a duty to make them seem so. So his thing was, people can tolerate two homosexuals they see leaving together. But if the next day they're smiling, holding hands, and tenderly embracing one another, then that can't be forgiven. It is not the departure for pleasure is intolerable, it is the waking up happy. Gregory Wood, on the other hand, wrote, gay critics made gay writers self-conscious, and I think this is true, about their sense of appropriate endings. No central gay character could be murdered or commit suicide after a certain point, even if for reasons clearly represented as being other than homosexuality itself, for fear of enforcing the myth of the tragic queer. So the homosexual writers became alert to the idea that if you allow your character to hang himself at the end of the book or drown himself, you're somehow or other entered into the spirit of your enemies to show that there is no chance for a homosexual to be happy. And I mean, the best example of this is E.M. Forster. He began his novel Morris as I said, in 1913, and he was acutely conscious, as I said, of this. So he began the book when a friend of Edward Carpenter's, who is a famous English socialist and homosexual, but Edward Carpenter's boyfriend was called George Merrill, and he took enormous interest in visitors to see Edward Carpenter. And he touched E.M. Forster, he touched his backside, quote, gently and just above the buttocks. I believe he touched most people's. I love that sentence. It's one of Foster's great sentences. I believe he touched most people's. The sensation was unusual, and I still remember it, as I remember the position of a long-vanished tooth. It was as much psychological as physical. It seemed to go straight through the small of my back into my ideas without involving my thoughts. So this single thing, George Merrill just touching Forster, anyway, I won't go into it, but it was great. And so Forster went immediately to Harrogate, where his mother was taking a cure, and immediately he began to write Morris. The general plan, the three characters, the happy ending for two of them, all rushed into my pen, and the whole thing went through without a hitch, and it was finished in 1914. Now, this is Forster. A happy ending was imperative. I shouldn't have bothered to write otherwise. I was determined that in fiction, anyway, two men should fall in love and remain in it for the ever and ever that fiction allows. And in this sense, Morris and Alec, the two characters in the book, still roam the greenwood. I dedicated the book to A Happier Year, and not altogether vainly. Happiness is its keynote, which, by the way, has made the book more difficult to publish. If it ended unhappily with the lad dangling from a noose, or with the suicide pact, all would be well, but the lovers get away unpunished, and consequently they recommend crime. More than 40 years after he wrote it, Forster was still concerned about the ending of the book, and he rewrote the ending, leaving it happy but more plausible. The lovers no longer lived together, which they did in the original draft, in a woodcutter's hut. He just got that out. The book was finally published in 1971, almost 60 years after it was written. While Forster in England did not feel free to dramatise his own sexuality during his lifetime, in other words, his other books, while they have suggestions of this, they don't deal with it in the precise and exact confrontational way or way that it happens in Morris. While he didn't feel free to do this during his own lifetime, there were writers in Ireland who were ready to put substance on shadow by writing fiction that dealt with homosexuality. Indeed, it is remarkable the number of writers, both gay and straight, who have dealt with this subject, from Forrest Reid from Belfast, who was a friend of Ian Forster's, to Pierce Hutchinson, John Banville, Desmond Hogan, Mary Dorsey, Frank McGuinness, Patrick McCabe, Cathal Sharkey, Tom Kilroy, Frank Ronan, Joseph O'Connor, Keith Ridgway, Anne Enright, Colin McCann, Emma Donoghue, and there's a novel coming out soon by Belinda McKeown, which also deals with the matter. But perhaps the two writers we should honour now and remember in this time of change and optimism for gay people in Ireland are Kate O'Brien and John Broderick. Both did their best by trying to stay in Ireland, even though it was difficult, and deal with their own homosexuality in their fiction. Both were followed by demons, different demons of varying sort. Both left Ireland finally towards the end of their lives to live unhappily in provincial England, O'Brien in Kent and Broderick in Bath. O'Brien was born in 1897 and died in 1974. John Broderick was born in 1927 and died in 1989. In a novel like The Trials of Father Dillingham, first published in 1981, John Broderick sought to dramatise the love between two middle-aged men in Dublin, Eddie and Morris, in the contemporary city. The great value of the novel is the way it normalises the gay relationship. Broderick is determined not to make his characters alarming or damaged by their sexuality or even damaged by the society or the environment. And they're not angels either. There's an element of dullness and ordinariness about them that is unusual in any novel that has homosexuality at the forefront. Neither Eddie nor Morris is defined by their sexuality, and the book's treatment of them may be a useful template for the ease and normality that gay people want or seem to want now. In 1941, Kate O'Brien published The Land of Spices, which is one of her best novels, and one of the greatest novels ever written about the religious life. It ranks with books by writers such as George Bernanos, Graham Greene, Willa Cather, Brian Moore, and Marilyn Robinson. And towards the end of the third chapter, the young Helen Archer, who will later become a Reverend Mother, and a very fierce one too. She comes home, she's lying in bed thinking about her father, and a memory comes to her of a day in Brussels when she was being brought up, and she came home unexpectedly from school. And I'm going to quote the entire passage. She ran up the iron stairs and along the balcony to the open window of her father's study. She looked into the room. Two people were there. But neither saw her, neither felt her shadow as it froze across the sun. She turned and descended the stairs. She left the garden and went on down the curve of Rue Saint-Isidore. She had no objective and no knowledge of what she was doing. She did not see external things. She saw Etienne and her father in the embrace of love. Etienne was a man. And this single image, the only reference to homosexuality in the book, the idea, the stark image of her coming to the door and seeing these two men in the embrace of love, is all the more explosive and dynamic because it's the only image of homosexuality in the book. For those 4 words, the embrace of love, the book was banned by the Irish Censorship Board. They are the very words now that in this campaign can animate us and nourish us. Because we're not talking here this week about abstract rights, abstract discrimination. We're not even talking about our sexuality. Rather, we are talking about love, about the embrace of love, about how our love equals the love of our fellow citizens who are heterosexual, and how right and necessary it seems to us, indeed how much of an imperative that our love should be, if we want, ritualized and copper-fastened and celebrated in marriage in the same way as everybody else's love. If there is someone who believes that our love is of a lesser order than theirs, how can they know this? Who have they asked? Kate O'Brien, who was a great stylist, was also a writer with a keen, brittle mind and a sharp eye. A tremendous maker of phrases, she mixed irony with sympathy in equal measure. As we come up to voting day, it seems fitting to invoke her great old spirit. Helen's father and the man in the land of spices were not merely embracing. They were in the embrace of love. That is what the girl saw, and it was perhaps that idea which so disturbed the censorship board. The idea that there was someone not willing to caricature sexual relations between men, but rather offer them dignity and suggestiveness. And then bring in the word that should dominate our thinking and our argument over the next week and perhaps beyond. The word is love, our love. That is what matters now. That is what we must embrace as equality comes close. Thank you. Thanks very much for coming out tonight. That's really great. So I think we're going to do a panel.
How we follow that? Could I call the three panelists who are going to join us here? Okay, I want to introduce now our other three panelists, who are my colleague Paul Delaney from the School of English, who has in fact edited a book of essays on Colm Tóibín's work, a wonderful book, which I very much recommend to you, based originally on a conference that was held on Colm's work here some years back. Paul has also recently published a very, very highly regarded, well-reviewed book on Sean Fallon. So that's my plug-in for my colleague, Paul Delaney. Next is Danielle Clark, who works on early modern women's writing particularly, but early modern writing generally, who teaches at our, what is it called? Our sister institution. It's out there in Belfast. University College Dublin, that's the one. Where she is actually currently head of the school, a very, very onerous task, which she's taken on just recently. And finally, again, from our own School of English, Heather Ingman, who teaches with us as an adjunct because she lives part of her time in Scotland, where I gather very extraordinary things have just been recently happening. And she has written most recently a book on Irish women's fiction, From Edgeworth to Enright, but before that, a very important history of the Irish short story. So I'm going to ask Paul if he would start off by commenting. What we've asked the other three panelists to do initially is to talk a little bit about how same-sex relationships in literature figure in their own research, and then we'll throw the discussion open to the floor. So Paul.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, that's great, thank you. When Pádraig and Brendan invited me to come this evening, I was very excited and very honoured, but they didn't tell me I'd have to talk a little about Colm's work with Colm sitting right beside me, which is really, really unnerving. So he can pull faces or do whatever, and I'll be oblivious to it. If Colm doesn't mind, I'm going to do that critical thing where I switch from the first person from Colm to Tóibín. Is that okay? It sounds a bit funny otherwise when Danielle's talking about William rather than Shakespeare. It doesn't sound right. Speaking at the launch of the Irish Queer Archive, which is up the road in the National Library here in Dublin a few years ago in 2008, Colm Tóibín made the following very poignant remark. Many of us who are gay will remember a time in our lives when it seemed that we were alone, that no one visible came before us, that we had no history. Admirers of Tóibín will recognize at once, I think, certain tropes and motifs here, which are central to Tóibín's oeuvre more generally, and which have been replayed over the last couple of decades to justifiable acclaim in his emotionally complex, deeply effective, and insistently humane body of work. Loneliness and the pain of individuation, memory and grief, the excavation of hidden lives, the veiling of a very secret part of the self, relationships between people and places and communities, and most importantly, perhaps families, relationships which are necessary but which are ambivalent and often strained, and above all, perhaps, history, and the necessity for us to think about history as we live in it and as we live through it. These are fundamental concerns, I believe, and I'm sure many here will agree, for any understanding of Colm Tóibín's work. His fiction and non-fiction, after all, has consistently explored the ways in which the past is spoken about and remembered, and it has often sought to unearth the strategies that are used, as well as the vocabulary that is deployed in any engagement with or construction of the past. It's also reflected at length on the uses of the past to justify or to make sense of the present, as well as the ways in which the past is given shape through narrative for specific effects or to a very particular purpose. Recovering the past and remembering what has been is an imperative, I believe, in Tóibín's work. But it repeatedly requires negotiation on the part of its characters, but also us as readers, with fear and pain. It also demands reflection on generic impulses and constraints, as well as a very serious consideration of the adequacy and also the inadequacy of language to express that which has perhaps necessarily been repressed from oneself as well as in front of others. This takes heightened importance in particular strands of Tóibín's oeuvre, including his explorations of gay and same-sex relations. The gay past in writing is sometimes explicit and sometimes hidden, while the gay present is for the most part only explicit. So Colm commented just a few moments ago, and so he also noted a couple of years ago in the opening chapter of Love in a Dark Time. Soon in the Western world, being gay will no longer involve difficulty and discrimination, he added. A prescient comment in the context of the impending referendum, recalling the not-so-distant censorship of artistic works in this country in the past, including, indeed, by those two great writers that Colm mentioned, Kate O'Brien and John Broderick, as well as the criminalisation of love. I want to conclude by reflecting just very briefly on how Tóibín has represented the past in part, and how so many gay men in his novels in particular are placed often in contexts in which they find it difficult to speak. One might think of the scrupulously reticent figure of the novelist Henry James in The Master, for instance, which Nikki mentioned at the outset, or the multiply secretive Richard Garay in Buenos Aires in The Story of the Night. Alternatively, one could consider the barely realised but nonetheless structurally central character of Declan Devereux in The Blackwater Lightship, or the painfully isolated Miquel, deep in the Pyrenees, in that very highly accomplished short story, The Long Winter. In each of these stories, Tóibín writes of characters who negotiate with, or indeed sometimes who have to collapse back into silence. It's a silence, to my mind, which I believe is the essential element of Colm Tóibín's aesthetic. But it's never a simple silence, and it is always deeply textured. It's a silence which complicates, but which absolutely enriches the quality of his work. And it's a silence that's open to interpretation, to nuance, and to insinuation. It's also a silence that informs the very subject matter as well as the style of the story which is being told, interleaving with Tóibín's narrative practice and impressing its mark upon and between the words which are included over and again on the page of his work. Interestingly, it's also silence which Tóibín has detected in the works of other writers. Reflecting on the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, for instance, Tóibín has praised the American's fierce simplicity and her use of words in which the emotion appears to be hidden, to lurk mysteriously between the words. It's a comment which could equally apply to Tóibín himself, for I believe it's between the words that Colm chooses, that we often find, I suppose, located a very particular and a very strange, powerful or emotion or energy to reside in his work. An energy which bubbles over into the most guarded and reticent of characters and texts over and again, but which is also tapped into in two of his most recent erotically charged stories, curiously both short stories, Three Friends and Barcelona 1975. It's such texts, I believe, and I'm going to stop perhaps, which represent to me, I suppose, this kind of enabling possibility and reality of visibility and love. Thank you.
Danielle, if you'd like to talk about much earlier period of literature.
I will, although I will come to it via slightly more contemporary observation, I suppose. And this is to do again with the explicit and the hidden that Colm referred to so eloquently, but particularly that idea about the continual reinvention of the gay past. And I was just struck as he was talking by sort of a memory of my younger self as a sort of voracious reader as a teenager, desperately trying to find images of something that I couldn't yet name. And unfortunately for me, one of the places that this turned up, of course, was in The Well of Loneliness, which I waded through at great length, only to eventually find the sentence, "That night they were not parted." And I thought, is this it? I thought. Anyway, I think unfortunately for me at that time, perhaps if I had spent a little bit more time in the backwoods of the 16th and 17th century, I might have actually found what I was looking for, to paraphrase badly. But I think in terms of the idea about the explicit and the hidden, I'd just like to return to that idea about the initial comment about being gay as being about sex. And of course, in the Renaissance period, they tended to kind of separate out ideas of acts and identities. And I think this is a kind of a really crucial thing to think of. We often think of those separations as negative, and they're not necessarily negative. I think in the Renaissance period, what you find is a kind of a continuum of relationships that can be accessed or hidden at various moments. And just to give you a flavour of this, and partly because it's beautiful too, I'm just going to read you a very brief passage from Marlowe's wonderful poem, Hero and Leander. And this is his description of Leander. You'll laugh in the first line, probably. His body was as straight as Circe's wand. Jove might have sipped out nectar from his hand. Even as delicious meat is to the taste, so was his neck in touching, and surpassed the white of Pelops' shoulder. I could tell ye, says the narrator, I could tell ye, how smooth his breast was, how white his belly, and whose immortal fingers did imprint that heavenly path with many a curious dint that runs along his back. But my rude pen can hardly blazon forth the loves of men, much less of powerful gods. Let it suffice that my slack muse sings of Leander's eyes, those orient cheeks and lips exceeding his, that leapt into the water for a kiss of his own shadow, and despising many, died ere he could join the love of any, not any happy endings in Hero and Leander, or indeed in Marlowe. But I think it's a very interesting example of the way in which I would see in this period quite a number of fairly open homoerotic passages dwelling on aspects of male bodies. Shakespeare's sonnets is a classic example, of course. It doesn't dwell very heavily on male bodies, but in terms of those ideas about articulations of love and so on. And I think it's really important to recognize in these kinds of texts as well the ways in which these moments take place in the context of other kinds of loving relationships. When Shakespeare's sonnets are published in 1609, nobody says, what's going on? Why has somebody written all of these sonnets to a man? Nobody notices this. Similarly, Marlowe's Edward II, staged multiple times through the 1590s, opens with a very open profession of love between Gaveston and Edward II. And there's an interesting passage there where I suppose the ways in which this is kind of thought of are envisaged in the sense that Mortimer, not very happy about Edward's liking for Gaveston, talks about the various kind of precedents. Greatest kings have had their minions, he says, and he brings all of these examples in of Alexander and so on. And of course, Mortimer Senior then says, oh, well, you know, he's young. He calls him a flexible youth. His youth is flexible, is what he says. So what he means is it's a phase. He'll grow out of it. And Mortimer Jr. is less convinced by this. But I suppose it's a way of kind of thinking about a continuum of relationships. And for the Renaissance period, what you have, I suppose, is a renewed interest in classical models, particularly. And if you kind of think about, there's a long list of possible terms. Homosexual is not a term that occurs in this period, but a lot of them would be classically inflected: minion, catamite, favourite, creature, Ganymede, siren, daemon, ingle, special friend, or to be in somebody's bosom is very important in these things. So the point here is about that idea of both explicit and hidden. These are kind of particular kinds of codes that might be read in particular ways. Shakespeare's sonnets is a lovely example of the use of the terminology of sweetness, where Shakespeare frequently refers to the sweetness of the beloved. And this is a kind of encoded way of suggesting that the love relation is something more than friendship, perhaps. Sonnet 38 is a very nice example. How can my muse want subject to invent while thou dost breathe that pour'st into my verse thine own sweet argument, too excellent for every vulgar paper to rehearse? So this idea of the beloved as thine own sweet argument, I think is very important. So I suppose I'd just kind of conclude by saying that it's not necessarily as you think it is when you look at material from earlier periods. Sometimes you have to read between the lines, but it seems to me that it's a very, very long and complicated and not necessarily linear journey to the moment where these kinds of relationships, these kinds of loves can be articulated as an open form of identity that infuses and shaped every aspect of an individual's being. So, thank you.
Heather.
Thank you. So I too would like to pick up on this theme of visibility versus invisibility in connection with my own research, which is in two areas of women's writing, really: modernist women's writing and Irish women's writing. And I think the two areas provide a striking contrast in the terms of the visible and the invisible. To start with modernism, 1920s Paris was really the place to be if you were a lesbian. Many English-speaking lesbian writers and their partners congregated in Natalie Barney's salon every Friday afternoon to read their work, chat, and generally enjoy themselves. They wrote poems, novels, and stories openly celebrating lesbian love. And such names as Gertrude Stein, H.D., the American poet Hilda Doolittle, Juna Barnes, and Radcliffe Hall, whose lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, was read in extracts in Natalie Barney's salon. Published in 1928, it prompted a court case in England and was subsequently banned. Virginia Woolf and E.M. Foster volunteered to testify on the novel's behalf, even though Woolf privately thought the novel was worthy but turgid, and Foster disapproved of lesbians. But actually, I always think it is an unfortunate novel to have such prominence, because Radcliffe Hall was essentially a very conservative woman, a Catholic. And she drew for her portrayal of the lesbian in The Well of Loneliness on sexologists like Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis at the turn of the century, who saw the lesbian as a male trapped in a woman's body, an invert. And it's this kind of gloom that pervades the well of loneliness. And the novel is rather stilted, melodramatic and self-pitying, but also perhaps strangely moving in the end. But this circle, Natalie Barney's Salon, also produced very innovatory and experimental writing, lesbian writing, by writers such as H.D. and Juna Barnes, whose Ladies' Almanac, based around Natalie Barney's Salon, was also published in 1928. Natalie Barney herself was a lesbian completely at ease with her own lesbianism, and in fact she had founded the Salon really to support other lesbians, to support women writers as well. But she felt none of Radcliffe's Hall's shame or, in fact, to give a quote from Natalie Barney, she said, "My queerness is not a vice, is not deliberate, and harms no one." She had numerous affairs, including with Dolly Wilde, niece of Oscar. So then to turn to my other area, which is Irish women's writing, which is where the invisibility perhaps comes in of the lesbian theme until recently. What Colm referred to as looking into the mirror and seeing nothing. There are various examples you could give. I could start with Elizabeth Bowen's work. The strong bonds between women running through the whole of Elizabeth Bowen's work, including erotic undercurrents. But scholars are really divided about how to read these bonds, whether they're explicitly lesbian. So here we come on to the theme of concealment and invisibility. Bowen is known to have had at least one affair with a woman. But there's no real overt lesbian sexuality in her novels. In a late novel like The Little Girls, one character is directly asked if she is a lesbian, and she remains silent. And you can interpret this in all sorts of ways. You could link it to one of Elizabeth Bowen's letters to Charles Ritchie, which were published recently, in which she talks of preferring emotions to remain uncategorized. So in a way, I find it easier to approach Bowen's work through queer theory rather than actually looking for lesbian certainties in her work. But she's certainly an important writer from the point of view of Irish lesbian women's writing. Kate O'Brien, on whom Colm spoke so eloquently, also, of course, is a really central writer on this theme. In Mary Lavelle, an earlier novel than The Land of Spices, Agatha Conlon acknowledges her love for Mary, but says that she's been instructed by a Catholic priest that she must regard this as a sin. Mary quickly responds that in her view, Agatha's love is no more a sin than her own love for a married man. So at least in this novel, lesbianism has parity with adultery, both being sins in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And this argument is continued in Kate O'Brien's later novel, As Music and Splendour, which is much more open in its celebration of lesbian love, while still acknowledging that in the eyes of the Catholic Church, it was regarded as a sin. I think it's significant that both these novels of lesbian love are set outside Ireland, in Spain and Italy. However, in The Land of Spices, set in an Irish convent, I think what the Irish Censorship Board missed, actually, was the growing, almost erotic bond between the young Anna Murphy at the convent school and her teacher, Helen Archer, the person who had discovered her father in the embrace of love. And there's that very important epiphany at the end of The Land of Spices, where Anna actually discovers her artistic vocation through looking at another young woman. So, there's lesbianism as well in the novel. It was just not what the Irish Censorship Board was homing in on. So if we pick up, finally, the question of, happiness in lesbian writing, of course, the lesbian themes became more visible with the growth of feminism in Ireland in the 1970s and 80s. And you get Mary Dorsey's marvellous short stories in A Noise from the Woodshed, published in 1989, which is a real celebration of lesbian love in Ireland, where the noise from the woodshed is the sound of two women making love, celebrating. Although the celebration in the stories is also hedged round with the ever-present threat to out lesbians from the society around them. And of course now we have more writers. Emma Donoghue's lesbian coming-of-age Stir Fry, published in 1994, followed by her other lesbian-themed novels such as Hood and Life Mask, set in the 18th century. So, you know, I would be optimistic. I would see a much more ability now to celebrate lesbian love in Irish writing.